Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Australian China Institute for Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. My name is Jing Han. I'm the director of the Australian China Institute for Arts and Culture. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting today at the various locations, particularly the Darug people of Darug Nation, where the Institute is located on Parramatta South Campus, and pay our respect to the First Nations elders, past, present, and emerging. We are very pleased to resume our Chinese Australian History seminar series. Chinese Australian history is a very important part of Australian history, and it is a key research area of this institute. Understanding the past enlightens us the way in which we perceive the present, and the close relationship between the past and present is sometimes forgotten. Today, we have our adjunct professor, Dr. Michael Williams, to give us lecture 2, From Gold to Artisans, 1851 to 1881. Please note our previously recorded sessions are available on our website. At the end of the lecture, we will have a Q&A session. So while Michael is talking, please post your questions on Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and I will collect them for Michael to respond when he finishes the lecture. Now, please welcome Professor Michael Williams.
Thank you, Jin, for that, and welcome everyone to this first Zoom lecture, at least first for me, but the second in-house series of lectures. As Jin mentioned, this is called From Gold to Artisans. The previous lecture was called Before There Was Gold, in which I talked about the close relationship between, or the long historical relationship between China and Australia and Chinese people in Australia before the gold rushes. But the gold rushes themselves tend to represent the most stereotypical view of the Chinese in Australia. And that's what I'll be perhaps focusing on today. Now here you can see I've chosen this cartoon to start the lecture off because what it represents to me, apart from being the fairly patronising view that Europeans tended to have of Chinese people in Australia that period and later, is an awareness of some of the reality that was happening. It's a bit outside our normal stereotypes. So as early as 1856, you can see this newspaper cartoonist was aware that Chinese people were perfectly capable of adapting and evolving and changing within the environment of the gold rushes, which is something that isn't always apparent from the more general histories that we have in the stereotypes of Chinese in Australia, particularly as it relates to the gold rushes. And so that's one of the reasons I picked this particular cartoon. But the question is, what are these stereotypes? What do we normally think of when we think of Chinese and the gold rushes in Australia? And of course, this is a more typical picture. Here we have an image, a contemporary image of people dressed in more traditional clothes, panning for gold. That's fairly obvious. And another thing we often think of is violence and lambing flat. And this is an illustration of a more contemporary in origin, but nevertheless based on sources from the past, showing that Chinese were victims of racism and so on. And again, this is a fairly stereotypical view. And by stereotype, I don't mean it's a wrong view. I simply mean it's a view that's narrow and perhaps doesn't encompass everything that we might consider as part of the history. For example, what about opera? What about souvenir sellers? What about doctors? Now, I mention these things simply as illustrations that there is a lot more to the history than simply searching for gold, digging gold, and sending money back home to China or going back to China. Chinese opera, medical doctors, just selling fans to the locals. These are all part of this early gold rush period, and something that we perhaps aren't often aware of. So the questions for today that I'll be considering in this lecture is why are some things remembered and others not? Is this a form of whitewashing? What does a focus on some aspects of the history only tell us about ourselves? And if the history is changing, and I acknowledge that it is, that in more recent times there's been new aspects, new perspectives given to Chinese Australian history. Is this a refining of history, or is it merely adding new stereotypes? And the key aspect of trying to answer these questions is that if we fail to understand motivation, that we need to look at people's motivation if we're to understand and answer some of these questions. So back to the gold rush. Now we know, of course, that the gold rush has attracted people from around the world to Australia, California at first, then Victoria, New South Wales, and later Queensland and other places in Australia. The majority were British that came to the Australian colonies, but they were also from America, the French, Italian, German, Polish, and Hungarians. And the largest non-British group were some 40,000 Chinese miners at their height on the Victorian goldfields. By 1861, for example, Chinese people made up some over 3% of the population, though nearly all men. One census reported 38,000 men to 11 women, Chinese women that is. And most returned to China. From the statistics we can see between 1852 and 1889, some 40,000 arrivals, some 36,000 returnees, although this of course involves people making multiple trips. But from this kind of analysis, much is excluded. A consideration of the villages, the home villages in China, Chinese opera, banknotes with Chinese script on them, medical doctors, etc. There's a range of things that can be included in the history and is in some, by some analysis, but not in the general perception of this history. So today I'm not going to give a complete overview, a chronological overview of the period from 1851 to 1881. What I will do is I'll give a brief overview, including this chronology here, but then I'll look at other aspects just to try and show what we're missing and why we're missing it, and what's in another broader aspect. And I'll also be looking at how contemporary perspectives are changing our views of the past. So a standard view of Chinese in the gold rushes would start with the early arrivals, the quick arrivals into Victoria. By 1855, there were some 18,000 people in Victoria. We know that the Victorians then instituted a poll tax and other discriminations to try and reduce the number of Chinese people entering the colony and going to the goldfields. And this entailed, among other things, a walk to road in South Australia. People landing at road by ship and then walking into the goldfields. And this particular more dramatic aspect of the history is often recounted. Then we have riots, such as the Buckland riots in Victoria, and then the more famous Lambing Flat riot a little later in 1861 in New South Wales, and then New South Wales as a colony instituting its own poll taxes, its own discriminatory regulations. 1862, there's some 25,000 Chinese in the Victorian goldfields, some 15,000 in New South Wales. Then we have in 1863 the Victorians repealing these discriminatory laws. In 1867, New South Wales follows suit, also repeals its discrimination. So for a period of time, there are no discriminations. There's more gold being found in Victoria and the Northern Territory. Queensland also tries to bring in some restrictions, although these are largely ineffective. And it's also worth remembering that although a statute may be on the law books, it doesn't always mean that they actually have a practical impact. And then in 1881, we have a renewal of restrictions. And this ends the period where we'll talk about those restrictions and why they came about in a subsequent lecture. So this is a very kind of standard overview of the history, but then we need to ask ourselves, whose perspective are we looking at? When we talk about restrictions, when we talk about discrimination, talk about racism, is this, whose perspective are we telling this history from? And I would argue that what we're telling it from is from very much a white perspective. So, and surprisingly little about this perspective changes even when we go into a more modern period, a more multicultural view of history. So the older view of this history would have been a white nationalist history, and then a more modern way of looking at it would be to say the contemporary view is a white guilt perspective. But, so therefore a shift from looking at Chinese in Australia, say victims who deserve it, or that the whites were justified in this kind of discrimination, to a more modern perspective to saying that they were victims who didn't deserve it. But in either case, the perspective is still very much a white orientated one. So what happens if we look at things but from a more Chinese perspective? What if, for example, we consider the Chinese were not victims at all? And what if white people are not the center of the story? What if we look, in fact, at a more Chinese orientation? So these are, again, some of the things we'll be doing later in the lecture. But before I move on to that, we'll look at what are these stereotypes that I'm talking about? What are the stereotypes of the Chinese in Australian history? Well, some of them are that people were very hardworking, that they only worked on the tailings, only dug for gold that had already been gone over by white miners, that they're relatively unchanging. They came, they dug for gold, and then they returned back home as quickly as possible. That they were men only, that they were largely sojourners, again, just coming to get the gold and returning home. And they were heading for something that we might consider to be, that was called a gold mountain, so something a bit exotic. That they were almost all gold miners, that perhaps they were driven out of China. This often appears in the general histories, that people were driven out by the Taiping Rebellion or by more general, more local Hakka Punti War. And that they were victims of racism, as you mentioned, such as Lambing Flat, or other conflicts such as at looms in Victoria in the 1870s. Now, I'm not arguing that any of these stereotypes are wrong, but I want to argue that they are often misunderstood in terms of what they mean, what their motivations were. And motivation is the key. And the motivation that we're looking at can be found in the villages, it can be found in family, it can be found in the methods by which people came to Australia, particularly what's known as the credit ticket method, continuing links with China and the families, organisation, how things were done, the role of Hong Kong, and particularly I want to emphasise this idea of the history of travel, a long history of people moving overseas. And by that history, I mean that the diaspora, the idea of people leaving Guangdong, leaving what we consider people to be called Cantonese people, leaving the villages and going overseas to work, had been well established some 200 years before the gold rushes of Victoria or New South Wales. And when I say well established, I mean a range of things, such as the things that we know about in Australian history, the organisation by district, the establishment of temples, the return of bones of those who die while overseas, the safe return of remittances to the families, multi-generational, that is to say sons, nephews and others kind of taking the place of older relatives in overseas businesses and such like, and local marriages, so marrying people locally in an area even when they may have a wife also back at home. So all these things, elements of Cantonese history that existed for some 200 years before the gold rushes of the Australian colonies. That people were going to northern Vietnam, they were going down to what we now know as Indonesia and Malaysia. They were going into the province of Guangxi, which is the province next to Guangdong. But in this period, in the 16th, 17th century, these were areas that were not fully integrated into the Chinese Empire, into the Ming or Qing empires. In fact, North Vietnam and Guangxi are much more closely related culturally in this period. And so for Cantonese people, going into these areas is like going into a foreign territory, a land where they don't speak the language, where they need their district organisation, they need support, but where they can make money, where they can earn, and do the kinds of things that they were doing in Australia. They say earning money and returning with it back to their villages. So if it's true then that this history of the diaspora history goes on for some 200 years before anyone ever arrived in Victoria, then you have to ask yourself, well, what's the influence of the Australian environment? What difference does it make when people arrive in Australia, in Victoria and New South Wales, if they've got most of these elements already set up? And of course, there are elements that are different, that there is an impact, there is a change, but we need to look more carefully at what these are. So I won't be able to go into all of these other details. I will talk a little bit about remittances, sojourning, Taiping rebellions, just to try to give you an example of some of the variations in perspective that I think we need to take into account. So one of them is women. Now, in recent times, people have made a lot of effort to look for women within the Chinese Australian history. And of course, there are women. There were those handful of Chinese women that had actually come, people such as Ang Chuk, for example, who came in 1861 at the age 16 to marry in Melbourne and stayed in Australia for the rest of her life and raised large families And she and a handful of people like her do exist, and people have been getting more information about them. And of course, their family history, their descendants have been finding out more over the years. Then there are, of course, women, non-Chinese women that married Chinese men within the Australian context. And these again, have been more research. But always there were, of course, large numbers of women in the villages, the mothers, the sisters, and of course the wives. And these were always part of this history. They've only been excluded or forgotten because we've been thinking in terms of Australia, in one location. We haven't been looking enough at the perspective that tells us that these continual links, these flows back and forth, are very important. So apart from this relative neglect of women and how their consideration of them has influenced the history, we've also settled on this kind of sojourning versus settling dichotomy. So the idea that people were sojourners, that they were only here temporarily in Australia and then they wanted to go home, or that they simply chose not to go home and they settled in Australia and became Australians and ancestors of Australians today. And both those views are true, but both those truths are also a bit false in the sense that it's more complicated history than that. If people are coming to Australia and perhaps settling, but sending their children back to be educated in China, or they themselves are leaving children in Australia, but going back to retire in a village, if the people are doing all kinds of different ways of living over the period of their life, is the sojourning settling dichotomy enough? And very often, in fact, we look at it only in those two ways, is a border guard view. It's a view of people who are only interested in drawing a border around Australia. And very often what we need, I think, is look more flexibly at this. And one way is to consider a simple term such as gold mountain versus goldfields. Now, I've mentioned this before in previous lectures, so I don't want to go into too much detail, but it's worth considering that the word Xinjiang, the characters, of course, literally do say new gold mountain or new gold hills or new gold scenery. I mean, obviously these characters can be interpreted. And in the 19th century, they were generally interpreted to simply mean goldfields. People went to the goldfields. But that makes Chinese gold miners the same as other gold miners looking for gold, looking to the goldfields. If they go to a gold mountain, it's a little bit more exotic, and it makes great titles for books and movies and so forth. And of course, by now, it's a bit late to change that interpretation. And I'm not suggesting we should. I'm just suggesting we should think about it as to why Gold Mountain was privileged over goldfields as an interpretation, and what we're doing in making Chinese look for an exotic gold mountain, while people from Britain or Ireland or whatever simply went to the gold fields. Now, I will talk a little bit more about this other aspect, just to give an example of how our perspective is influenced by our needs within Australia. So very often you read in the general histories that people were forced out of China by the Taiping Rebellion. Now, the Taiping Rebellion was quite a major rebellion against the Qing during the middle of the 19th century, went from about 1850 to 1864, killed millions of people. It was quite devastating. And of course, the timing overlaps very much with the early part of the Pacific gold rushes. So it seems a very plausible explanation, particularly if you think you need an explanation as to why people left China to come to the goldfields. But I think it explains nothing. And the reason it explains nothing is a simple look at the map. You can see this red area here. This is the major area of the Taiping devastations. Guangdong province itself was relatively unaffected, not to say it wasn't affected, but relatively unaffected. The millions of people affected by the rebellions of Nanjing and other areas did not go to any goldfields. They didn't travel anywhere. The people who travelled were those that were already travelling, as I mentioned before, from the history of the diaspora, from generations before, from mostly a handful of provinces in the middle of Guangdong, and particularly people who were relatively close to the new port of Hong Kong. So they were travelling, they were used to travelling, they were used to this idea of sending men overseas to work and return over many years. Hong Kong simply gave them other ports to go to, destinations such as California or Sydney or Melbourne, in the goldfields nearby. So again, you have to ask yourself, well, why then are people using these explanations? Why do they seek for the Taiping Rebellion as an example, as a reason for people to travel, to move? And that's because they want to make Chinese gold miners different. They want to make them say, well, they were pushed out, they were poor, they had no choice. And that's different from us, meaning say from European gold miners, other gold miners that considered to have more legitimate reason to be looking for gold in Australia. But in reality, when you look at it, as some observers suggested, they pretty much went looking in a spirit of gambling. They went looking for adventure. They were looking for money. They were doing all the things that people from the villages of Britain or Ireland were also doing, or Hungary or America or wherever. They were trying to seek their fortunes. But there were differences, of course, and these differences have to do more with organisation and with continuing links back to family and to villages. So what I'm suggesting, of course, is then that the history is much more complex. It's not just gold, it's fishing, for example. Large fishing industries were established in Victoria and New South Wales. Fishing for, that was salted and then sent off to the goldfields. So a supply for people on the goldfields. It's about shopkeepers. It's about people supplying goods. It's about setting up businesses. It's about scrub cutters and market gardeners, cooks and carpenters. So a range of other occupations. Some by the same people who stopped gold mining and decided to do something else, and other people who never took up gold mining. It's about carpenting, shipbuilding. More of these things later on, of course, but even right early in the period, in the 1860s, many of these things are happening. Medicine, doctors, of course, and opera. Right from the beginning, we have Chinese opera in the goldfields of Victoria, and right through the 20th century, right through the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century. It's also about organisation, about how people sent their money back. Account books, this picture here is an account book kept by a man who sent money back continuously for many, many years. He sent it back as gold dust, he sent it back as gold sovereigns, he sent it back as British pounds. He spent it over many, many years. He didn't ever go back to China himself, but he continually sent money back to family in the village. So is he a sojourner or is he a settler? You know, what is the boat ship, the man who kept this account book? You know, what was his motivation in remaining? What was his motivation in continuing to send money regardless? We need to know more or think about more about people's family relationships if we were to understand his life and his role within Australian history. So we talked about bones returned. It was a common thing. People knew about bones returns. But while that can be seen as being a part of traditional Chinese culture, we should remember that people from very early on were converting to Christianity. And in fact, one of the first records we have of bones returns also records that some of the people whose bones were being returned at the villages were Christians and wanted to be buried as such. So again, there's merchants, there's trade, there's a charting of ships. There's a whole range of things going on within this history that this goes well beyond simply people panning for gold. And so we have to ask ourselves then, why has so much of this been whitewashed? Whether to say, why is it being forgotten, or why does it seem unusual to talk about, say, Chinese opera? I mean, why is it seen as something that's a bit unusual? Why have people not heard of it before? And if it's been put back, if our more modern look at the history, with more and more people doing studies and research, doing more family history, doing more PhDs in Chinese Australian history, if they begin to put things back, what are they putting back? Are they putting everything back, or are they putting back things selectively for their own purposes? That is to say, is present, again, influencing our perceptions of the past. So what are these less regarded aspects? And the point I want to make is that these aren't less regarded because we don't know about them. These aren't less regarded because people at the time didn't know about them. For example, this is a quote from 1867 from a missionary who travelled quite around Australia, a missionary to Aboriginal peoples mainly, but he did come across many Chinese, and he said, they have brought the miscellaneous bazaar, the opium hall, the gaming table, the theatre, and the barber shop. As I say, he saw a range of activities that Chinese people were bringing into the colonies. But if you look at the history, you look at that list and you think, well, yes, people probably know about opium, they know about gambling, but do they know about bazaars? Do they know about selling of souvenirs? Do they know about the theatre? Do they know about barbershops? If they don't, why? Why was it kind of neglected from the history, even though the sources are there at the time? One of my favourite quotes from the opera, for example, is this image of one European observer of 1,000 pigtails smoking cigars and drinking ginger beer. And my reason for liking that particular quote is that it simply gives an image of people enjoying themselves, enjoying their entertainment, and just kind of innocently smoking cigars and drinking ginger beer. Quite a different image than the normal one we have of Chinese during the gold rush period, or even subsequently. Now, another aspect, before we move on, is this idea of the repeals. Now, again, a strong aspect of the history is the idea that discrimination was brought in, poll taxes were brought in, tonnage restrictions to restrict the number of people coming in by boat. And this means that what we talk about, we emphasize, the control that people had over Chinese, but we've got to think about, they also repealed these things. So Victoria brought its restrictions in 1855, repealed them by 1861. New South Wales brought them in 1861 and had repealed them by 1867. So why would they repealing them? Why bother to reduce this? And there's various arguments about them. It's not usually talked about too much in the history, but before we even move on to that, I want to talk about the original restrictions of Victoria of 1855. Now, we often say these were the first restrictions put on by any colony. But the reality was that in Victoria, the newly independent colony of Victoria, only independent in 1851, actually tried to restrict not Chinese, but Tasmanians in 1853. So the gold rushes have just begun, and Tasmanians have begun to come from Tasmania to the gold. Not much gold in Tasmania, they're coming over to the gold rushes in Victoria. The Victorians don't like this. They consider the Tasmanians to be all ex-convicts. And so they, in fact, in 1853, introduced a restriction to prevent people entering. And the British disallow this law. So the Victorians wanted to have it, but it was disallowed by the British on the grounds that they'd given pardons to these Tasmanian convicts, and the colony of Victoria had no right to restrict them. Of course, the pardons were all conditional, and the condition was that they not go to Britain. But the British were quite happy with that hypocrisy and said, well, no, you can't stop them from going to Victoria if they want to. However, while the Victorians were forced to allow Tasmanians to come to Victoria, they weren't. They were able to put a restriction a couple of years later on the Chinese. So the first restriction was, in fact, in 1855 to restrict Chinese. But it gives us an idea that the Victorians were very intent upon controlling who came into their colony. They already established, or were trying to establish, an identity about themselves, and this extended even to people from Tasmania. And just in passing, Ned Kelly there is the son of a Tasmanian ex-convict. So the Victorians perhaps had some reasons behind their act. So in 1867, New South Wales decides to lift its restrictions. And there's an argument, a debate about this. Why are they doing this? And it's worth reading. I'll read from that extract from the Sydney Morning Herald, outlining why they're deciding to lift these restrictions, because they're quite indicative of what the attitude is towards Chinese in Australia soon after. So we begin with that first day, they say Chinese, at first day had no advocates, except among ministers of religion and the enlightened few, whom a truly liberal education had enabled to look beyond class prejudices. So what we're seeing here is something we recognise from today, that you should simply treat people equally. You should treat people as you treat other people, and there's no need to have restrictions. But as the writer recognises, only a few people actually had this view in 1867. The majority of people had a much more pragmatic attitude. Now they have friends everywhere. Farmers have learnt to value them as men who are ready to do a fair day's work for a fair day's wages. So again, you've got a certain class of people here who are quite happy to welcome Chinese people into Australia because they see them as good workers, presumably, when they say a fair day's wage, from that perspective, boss's perspective, are presumably cheaper wages. And so this is a pragmatic view, that they're okay because we can make use of them. This is even further described. Hotel keepers and private gentlemen who can afford to care about their cookery have again and again fallen back on John Chinaman when European cooks failed, and have found him skillful, painstaking, and singularly good-humoured. So again, you can see the idea is, well, if we can make value of these people, then why shouldn't they come? It's not about John Chinaman marrying my daughter, it's about John Chinaman being a good cook, and luckily he's a good-humoured one as well, at least as far as the writer of this is concerned. But of course, this brings up other aspects of the history. Not everybody is pleased to have John Chinaman play this role as a cheap worker. Not everybody's content with this, and this is, of course, a crucial aspect of the hostility that begins to grow again at the end of the period in the 1881. And this happens very quickly. 1879, there's a seaman strike. Now, unfortunately, the ship owners decide to try and bring in Chinese labour in order to break the strike. And so this immediately brings into clash the wishes of workers and against the perception of Chinese labour. And this is challenged, however, by a number of men, local men, Liu Amoy among others, who had been living in Australia for many years, had all taken out naturalisation. They were naturalised Victorians, and they published a very interesting book called The Chinese Question. And they said, among other things, in the present grave emergency, so the emergency about discussion of bringing in restrictions on Chinese people to Australia, we appeal as natives of China and as citizens of Victoria to the reason, the justice and the right feeling and the calm good sense of the British population of Australia, not to sanction an outrage upon the law of nations, not to violate the treaty engagements entered into between the government of Great Britain and Emperor of China. So here they're trying to again argue a more modern view to say, well, you just got to treat people well. You can't treat people with disrespect. We are here. We are citizens of Victoria. If you have a good view about the law of nations, you should not be introducing these restrictions. Unfortunately, despite this argument, these restrictions were, as we know, quickly introduced. And this is partly because of the labour question and partly because of a number of other issues. Now, I just want to turn now to the other issue here that I've raised, and that is what is going to come back into the history. So we know about these things, we know about resistance, we know about what people were doing. And what we found in the last 10 or 20 years is that there has been a revival of some knowledge of some aspects of Chinese Australian history beyond lambing flat and beyond restrictions, including, of course, lambing flat. Lambing flat has actually created its own festival, a festival particularly designed to bring in Chinese tourists. Rookwood has got its own little memorial to Chinese miners that was set up by a group of Chinese immigrants to Australia of recent origin. Tasmania has its own Tin Dragon's Tail. That's to say, a tourist trail outlining the history of Chinese in Tasmania. Orange Museum has recently commissioned and set up a particular display outlining its Chinese Australian history. Amoy Shepherd's memorials have been set up in southern Queensland. Chinese Anzacs have had memorials, and there have been memorials to specific people such as Billy Singh. Some of these things are outside our period of the gold rush, but I just wanted to show that quite a range of new things are happening that are changing our perspectives. The memorial, the picture there is a memorial at Robe in South Australia to the walkers that landed at Robe and then walked into the Victorian goldfields. Now, the question is why is this happening? Why is this change happening? And it's a range of reasons. There's tourism, again, a pragmatic attitude, the attitude that people should be, want tourists to come, tourist dollars. You want to attract Chinese tourists, you have money now, then you have to have something that's of interest to them. It's also about white guilt, about people feeling that they should be making atonement for some of these things. There's a kind of migrant progress idea. This is to say recent migrants to Australia of Chinese heritage, Chinese origin, wanting to reflect back on other people, on the history and have a connection, a longer connection with Australia that goes back to the gold rush period and seeking to kind of bring this out more and perhaps also seeking to show the progress that the people suffered in the past. They are coping better today. It's about identification with the past. It's also about family history. Many people are discovering that they have Chinese ancestors in their past going back to the gold rush, if not before. And it's even been, there's even been accusations made that it's all a Beijing plot, that the Chinese Communist Party is in fact trying to kind of beef up the Chinese Australian history in order for its own purposes to show a connection with Australia. I won't go into too much detail as to what all that means or what a Beijing plot could mean, but But some of the money for some of these memorials have come from China or from Chinese businesses, and inevitably in the modern paranoid situation we have, there have been links made as if this is intentional kinds of history making. But I would argue that, of course, there's not much credence to be given to that. But there are, like any history needs to be looked over, and motivations need to be analysed. So, as I said, the Lemming Flat Chinese festival is perhaps one of the more interesting of the current ways of highlighting the history. Here, they've made an effort to kind of try and make what's an embarrassing history or a violent history, a negative history, and turn it into something, well, that doesn't deny the history, but it also is of interest to people. And this is a memorial at Lemming Flat near where the riots took place. Now, some of this is based upon a sense of trying to highlight the racism, or it's also a sense of kind of focusing on Chinese as victims. It's a white guilt issue. It's also a migrant success story, to say that people are successful today over what had happened in the past. Some of it is based on exaggeration. So, for example, the Lemming Flat issue is often exaggerated. The reality is that no one is actually killed at Lemming Flat, though very often this is the assumption, and this is sometimes perhaps a matter of trying to keep up with Americans. The Americans had a more violent history, a lot more people were killed, and often it's considered, well, if similar things happened in Australia, there must have been a similar deaths. But certainly in terms of Lemming Flat, this is not the case. This memorial at Brookwood Cemetery was put up, and at the time it was being designed, the memorial was originally going to say a memorial to those that were killed at Lemming Flat, until it was pointed out that no one had been killed at Lemming Flat. And so it now says a memorial to those who might have been killed at Lemming Flat. So a slight concession there. But the question is then, were the Chinese so hapless? Were they always victims? I mean, again, this is something that we want to continue to look at. Not about denying racism, not about denying violence, but certainly to show that people were more in control of their life and in control of what they were doing than constant continual looking at the specifics, such as Lemming Flat, might lead us to believe. So overall, we're going to go back to our original question. So what does all this mean? I've tried not to give you an overview of the history or potted history. I've given you a very basic idea, but just trying to make you think more differently about the history and what we need to look at, where we need to be looking at China, look at families, look at jobs and occupations other than gold in order to bring this out. And then in the end, the purpose is to try and answer some of these questions. They were the why are some things remembered and others not? Is this a kind of whitewashing? What does a focus on some aspects of history only tell us about ourselves? And if the history is changing, is this refining of history, or is it merely adding new stereotypes? So in this case, the first question is why are some things remembered and others not? Is this a kind of whitewashing? And I would say that definitely this is what's happened in Australian history. We've had a long period of whitewashing, and I can't emphasize this too much. I mean, the White Australia policy, and I prefer to call it the White Australia project. If we call it the White Australia policy, it tends to focus on the immigration restrictions and the dictation test, and to make out it was just a matter of laws. And if we rescind those laws, then everything is okay. Australia ceases to have a White Australia aspect and becomes multicultural. And of course, as I think we've seen in more recent times, the underlying aspect of White Australia is still very much there. And this is because it was much more a policy and much more of a project, a powerful psychological project that established for many, many generations the very concept of what was normal and what it was to be an Australian. You know, the old complaint that many people have, you know, constantly being asked, where did you come from? The idea being, of course, that people with a certain look don't get asked those kind of questions. And you look at these two pictures here. Why is one person seen more readily to be Australian and the other not? In actual fact, neither of them were born in Australia. Both of them migrated to Australia, but the one Is it known, well known and established, and it can see himself as being a leading figure within Australian history and is generally perceived to be in Australia. The other is unnamed. The picture simply says he's a cook, presumably one of these good humoured cooks mentioned previously. But both of them migrated to Australia. Both of them came to seek money. Both of them came to do what they wanted to do to achieve a life in Australia. But the whitewashing, the view of Australian history says we know more about one regardless of his birth in Britain and less about the other. We don't know about his, whether he's smoking. The assumption would be he's smoking opium, more than likely he's simply smoking tobacco. He could be drinking ginger beer, going to the opera. These are aspects of his history that we don't often consider. And it's largely because of this mentality that says a certain kind of history is normal and we regard the other as being exotic. It's not as exotic as we think. So, what does the focus on some aspects of the history tell us about ourselves? Certainly it tells us that there's been a great deal of this othering going on. I mean, Chinese in Australia are kind of considered to be always migrants. I mean, regardless of the fact that history goes back many generations back, well into the before the gold rushes. We don't see Chinese Australian history necessarily as normal. We consider the class as a migrant history, different from, say, British or Irish history, which, while technically is always a migrant history, it's not really treated in that way. Goldfields is normal, gold mountains exotic, and of course there's an element of self-orientalizing here. The gold mountains idea is very much taken up by people with Chinese heritage as well as non-Chinese heritage. It's simply something that happens, this idea that there's a certain level of exoticism going on. The opera, again, I mentioned this not because the opera is the most important thing that was happening, but it's something quite lively and was well known in the 19th century, early 20th century, and it's largely been forgotten from our history. And the question is, can white guilt or the migrant struggle accommodate this image of the cigar smoking and ginger beer drinking opera goers? It's simply a different view, which takes in different aspects and a broader aspect of what people's history is all about. We need to do a lot more work before this idea of opera goers or sunglass wearing Chinese doctors becomes a normal part of Australian history. And finally, we have a question. If the history is changing, is this a refining of history or merely an adding of new stereotypes? And here, I want to say, if tourism is a good reason for adding to a history, but it's a pragmatic approach, and it tends to mean you focus on certain aspects of the history. Identification is important, but then it brings up the question of what is Chinese. If someone migrates to Australia today from Beijing or Shanghai, and they feel that they have a long history of Chinese in Australia, are they identifying with people who are Chinese? Do they care that these people were Cantonese speakers or Taishan speakers that had a very different lifestyle and very different thinking from people from Shanghai or Beijing? Or does it matter that they're all Chinese together? Who's making them Chinese? What does that label mean? I'm not saying you shouldn't, of course, identify with people in the past that you think of as Chinese, but simply you do need to think about what were the differences. White guilt, of course, white guilt is a perfectly good thing. People should atone for the guilt for the violence and the negative of the past. But you've got to be careful about who are you making central to the story? Who is that history about? And finally, this idea of Beijing Plotters. There is, of course, a view of history that is encouraged by the Communist Party in China, and many people are educated in that history in China, and they bring that to Australia. But then the question is this, if people use that interpretation to interpret Australian history or Chinese Australian history, should you be paranoid about that, or is this simply an alternative perspective that we should also negotiate and discuss with in historical terms, just as we would any historical perspective? And again, I would argue that motivation is the key, and all of these various kinds of motivations that we need to take into account. So finally, I just want to emphasize that if we don't have a full view of the history, if there are many things that we need to learn and to take into account, it's not the fault of the contemporary observers. The observers of the gold rush era period might have been patronising and ignorant of Chinese culture, but they knew what was going on. And what they have to say, we can interpret and use. If we've missed certain things, we've forgotten certain things, it's more the fault of later history, seeking always to bring in its own perspectives. And that means that we need to be aware, I think very much that history is a constant struggle with the present. And we must look to our own motivations if we are to even aspire to an objective view. And I'll leave it there. I just suggest some readings here. I've just put up on screen briefly. When you look at the tape of this, you'll be able to take a screenshot of that if you're interested in looking at more details. But for now, I'll say thank you very much for your attention, and I'll leave it over to Jin.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. This is such an interesting talk about the history, not only just about history, but very much about your interpretation, your understanding, which is a very nuanced and very balanced view. It's really fascinating, right? You know, like a history that we often heard, particularly in relation to Chinese Australian history, is very one-sided. You know, like gold rush is gold only. So you don't really hear other aspects. So it's quite fascinating that you brought up all the other aspects that people often don't think of, especially for people who are not in the history area. So it's quite interesting. We have a few questions. So I will start with the first one. While the people can still just keep posting your questions on the Q&A function, I will read them and then bring to Michael. The first one, Michael, as you mentioned, the gold miners, when the gold rush started, and gold miners came from quite a number of places, you know, Britain, all sorts, Europe, many places, as well as the Chinese. Why were Chinese miners were particularly picked for all sorts of, you know, discrimination to a point? Is that because of the racial differences primarily?
Well, they didn't. It's interesting. They wouldn't have used the term racism. The term racism wasn't even invented until much later in the period. But they did talk about things like class and culture, and you know, we today would of course identify this as being racism. You've got to imagine that the people in Australia were very narrow, incredibly narrow. I mean, a lot of them were just from villages in Britain themselves. I mean, the British at this time hated the French and hated the Irish. You know, they saw the Irish as almost a completely different race. So you've got to think of how narrow these people were. And so to suddenly have a whole bunch of Chinese people arrive dressed in traditional dresses, traditional Chinese outfits and different kinds of hats, speaking different languages, doing everything they did was quite remarkably different. And these people, Australians or the Australian colonists, were very, very narrow-minded and kind of were suspicious of people from Scotland or people from London or people from the next village. So, you know, it's not unusual to think that they've had a hard time coping with people who were very, very different. And although they could gradually kind of cope with people from other parts of Europe, they couldn't really, some of them tried, some of them did very well. I would say, I don't want to overemphasize it, people did. It was perfectly possible to become friendly and to deal with people from China. Many people did, but others made no effort to do that. I mean, this was a time when Europeans had to change their names as well. I mean, there were many people in it. You know, as I mentioned, there were people from Hungary, from Spain and various countries in Australia. But we often don't know that because many of those people changed their names. They found it hard to cope. You know, someone named Rodriguez just changed their names to Roger. You know, I mean, they just, you know, even that small, what we consider today, or small deviation from the Anglo worldview was enough to get them in a bit of trouble. So they would change their names. And, you know, you have to kind of look at the family history to realize that your ancestor was actually from Poland or from Hungary. You don't realize because your name is Smith. So yes, it's not unremarkable. I mean, the first arrivals of the Chinese were actually treated quite well because they were so exotic, so different that people were amused. There's a very interesting account on the Bathurst goldfields of 150 Chinese people arriving and the crowd of Bathurst people looking at the camp and being amused by chopsticks, people using chopsticks, and fascinated by their ability to make a fire and cook a meal with a very small amount of firewood. It seems that the Europeans in Bathurst just burnt whole logs when they were burning a fire, but the Chinese were used to grass fires in the villages of South China, were very careful and burnt a very small amount of wood. And this was noted, you know, people realized how different people were. They didn't imitate it. They continued to burn down trees all the time when they were cooking, but they did notice that people did it in a much more efficient way. But then later on, as time goes by, yeah, there were reasons for kind of othering Chinese people. And unfortunately, this involved labour relations as well, which I didn't go into in a lot of detail. I will in the next lecture, but very often the Chinese were used as strike breakers and scabs and so forth. And this, of course, caused a great deal of anxiety and trouble. And unfortunately, because the Chinese kind of worked together, they were simply told by their headmen to go and do this job. And they didn't, I think, quite realise that they were being used as strike breakers and what animosity this was going to cause them initially.
Yeah, that's very interesting, especially exotic looking, exotic side.
Oh, you
it reminds me
another planet, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a similar thing in China in the early days when Westerns came to China, that, poses a very exotic site for Chinese people. So that was a quite interesting, like a similarity, but then obviously that leads to different outcome. Another question is, you mentioned there were majority are men, and there were really 11 women of all the Chinese migrants here in the early days. And you also mentioned the local marriage. Can you tell us who did those Chinese miners marry to?
Well, the stereotype, again, there's a lot of stereotypes. The stereotype is, they were just from poor Irish girls. The Irish migration was unusual in that quite a large number of single women came to Australia, and they were more, the idea was that they were more inclined to marry Chinese. But again, this is a stereotype. There has been some work done, particularly by, more recently by Sandy Robb in Northern Queensland, for example, and others. And what they found is, in fact, there's quite a wide range of women that were marrying Chinese men, just as likely to be British, English, or Scottish as Irish. Mostly poorer classes, that's true. I mean, there were middle-class women who married richer Chinese men, but I mean, that was typical of the day. I mean, a middle-class woman wouldn't marry a poor man, whether he was Chinese or not. They tended to marry in their class. And so the Chinese men were by and large workers. They were peasants, and they were people working in gold mining. So they married women of that class, poorer women, but a wide range of backgrounds. Sometimes, again, some of them might have been forced working as prostitutes or others, or people who were escaping domestic violence situations. There's certainly those kinds of stories where they took refuge in Chinese camps or in Chinese households where they were treated better. That was, again, many stories to talk about that. But, it's a mixture of things. I mean, it wasn't the stereotype of them being Irish prostitutes or drunkards. It's true in some cases, but certainly by no means true in all cases. A range of people. And with the work of Kate Bagnon and other people, we know that there were very successful relationships, very strong relationships, loving relationships, no different from the kinds of marriages of anyone else. Strong family relationships, children growing up, being taught Chinese, women going back to the villages as well. Many of the white wives would go back to the villages and live there, teaching English and do other things, go with their kids, come back. I mean, that didn't always work out. People came back and were discovered that there was another wife in the village, and that didn't go down well, but that wasn't, always the case. Almost any variety of case did exist. And so that's why it's very always dangerous to go for these stereotypes, because they're just almost never wholly true.
Yeah, it's really interesting, especially stereotype, and you mentioned older stereotypes, and then I will get to the question, someone asked a question about the new stereotype. But before I get there, this is a question: shall I suggest that the Chinese migration history also related to history of a British colonial history? What's your view?
Well, I mean, obviously, this is the key point with Hong Kong. I mean, you've got, as I said, I mentioned there was a long history of Chinese diaspora into Guangxi and northern Vietnam and other parts. So that's an interesting difference. I mean, at one point, northern Vietnam was part of the Ming Empire, and then they threw that off, but Guangxi continued to be part of the Chinese Empire. And so you've got Chinese, Cantonese people going into an area where they control things. Their government is in control. There may be occasional disputes with locals, but by and large, they're in control. When they go to Southeast Asia, they're in control. They become part of the colonial empire there, and they're squeezed in between the Dutch elite, for example, in Indonesia, and the native peoples of Indonesia, and they act by and large as middle people. In Australia, it's not quite the same issue, but of course, it's the ability of the colonies to clear the land, to have destroyed Aboriginal cultures and to usurp the land from them. Then it allowed Chinese people to do the same thing, to come in and take advantage of that. And this is, again, one perspective that is coming in more and more now, the realization that it's not good enough for people of Chinese origin to say, oh, well, we were oppressed by the whites, therefore we're okay, and we don't have anything to do with this colonial attack on Aboriginal culture and taking over the lands. It's all mixed together, and people need to know that the Chinese were taking advantage of that as much as anyone else, and successfully they were doing that. So certainly, yes, it's certainly a colonial history. We can't forget that.
Yeah, a very good question. A question from Kevin. In the course of your research, did you find any contrast or similarities in the portrayals of Chinese people in Australia in the 19th century with portrayals of other people from, like, for example, Indian subcontinental or other parts of Asia who were living in Australia?
Yes and no. I mean, the numbers are much different. So there's a much smaller numbers of people from India and so forth. And what tended to happen is that people went into kind of niche occupations. So the stereotype of Indians in Australia is either as hawkers or as Afghans and camels and so forth. And so you get the stereotypes there. So they're not comparable. So the Chinese are market gardeners and carpenters. And so they're not really compared very much, except in terms of high policy. When they're talking about the White Australia policy and the need in Australian Federation terms to have an immigration restriction that would restrict all non-white people, then everybody's lumped together, and it's all about being non-white, all about being Asians. But on the local level, on the level of people's lives, no, they tended to make distinctions between people and not lump everybody together. There was no sense of being Asian generally. It was. I mean, India was quite familiar to people in Australia because it was part of the British Empire, and many people working as officials in Australia, for example, had also worked as officials in India. And so there was kind of more knowledge about India than we think of nowadays. I mean, nowadays, think of India as a separate country like China, but in the colonial period, it was another colony. And so India had a special case, but the numbers were much smaller. And so generally people were quite used to the distinctions and didn't mix things up all that much. Japanese and Chinese tend to get mixed together at a time after a while, particularly in the beginning of the 20th century.
Well, I think they still do mix Chinese up with Japanese. When I was in the Northern Territory and I was approached to buy paintings and assuming that I was a Japanese tourist. So to today, they still do that. That's interesting. Another question from Diana asking, interesting question if you know, what reasons do the contemporary descendants of the Chinese who came to the gold rush give about their relatives? Turmoil in their area in China, interest in making money, other reasons?
Oh, well, this is a problem. The family history, yes, I mean, obviously, the people often don't know. I mean, they're digging up the family history and they're talking about people going back. A few families have quite a lot of information. They know their ancestor came as a merchant and they were quite wealthy, or others different things. But usually they just have a name and they don't really have any more knowledge about why people came than they read in the general histories. What we do find, what I have been finding, is a few people are simply latching on to the history as it's told in China, which tends to be the more extreme history that kind of associates, say, what was happening in Cuba or the kidnappings and so forth, and says, well, all Chinese went overseas in that way. And so let's assume that their ancestor was kidnapped in some way and dragged across and enslaved in Australia. Now, there's very little of that in Australia, or hardly any of that. It's, as I say, it was voluntary migration. It was people in debt to other relatives through the credit ticket system. And so sometimes people simply take up the history as it's told in China and apply that to Australia. And that's causing a bit of angst and needs to be argued out a little bit. And people just see that the Australian circumstances is not the same as Cuba or Peru or even the railways of America. That's another well-known story of the silly up people in building the railways in America. That's one particular story that doesn't have a parallel. Well, not much of a parallel in Australia, a little bit in the Northern Territory, but nothing comparable. So you've got to make these distinctions if you really want to track things down. But unfortunately, people don't know. What would they know about an ancestor 100 years ago they only have a name? So they need to have a general idea. They'd be very lucky if they get any very specific information. But generally, if you look at the villages that I'm familiar with in, say, Zhongshan, I would relate it to people simply being brought up by an uncle and borrowing money. This is the stories that we know of most of the time in Australia, but there are always individual exceptions to any general history that you make up.
Another question about identity. Question of identity. Are the Chinese interested in becoming Australian, or are they always sojourners?
Well, I don't think that's always been the case. People have always been interested in becoming Australian. Lo Kong Meng and the others, as I mentioned in the Australian question back in 1879, said that they were proud Victorians. I mean, they'd been Victorians for many years and they had every intention of staying in Australia. They had family, they'd married in Australia, but they were concerned for their fellow Chinese, and they had relations with China in terms of family and business and so forth. So they wanted to, like people do today, they wanted to make sure Australia had a good relationship with China and with their family, whether they're in Hong Kong or Taiwan or wherever. And that doesn't make them less Australians. I mean, Australians of British descent would be concerned if suddenly Australia declared war on Britain and decided that they had enough. The British were just crazy. People would be concerned. It wouldn't make them less Australian just to be concerned about these issues. So no, I don't think people have ever really been sojourners. I mean, I've used that term from myself when you look at it from a village perspective. But I think the history is more complicated, and it's about family, and it's about continuing links and a strong link with the villages, which lasts over many generations and continues with just a more generalised link with China. We've got to remember in Australian history, there were people in the 1920s and 30s who would call Britain home. They were Australian born and they would consider Britain to be home, despite that generation. It took many generations for Australians of a particular class to think of Australia as quite separate from Britain, and they related to that for cultural reasons or family reasons or whatever. And it took a long, long time for that to kind of drift away. I mean, it's the same for any people of a migrant heritage in Australia. Why would they give up their connections with another place in 1 or 2 generations? Why should they? In a modern world, it's not necessary, and it shouldn't be seen as something that stops them being Australians. That's what Australia is all about. It's having connections with the world as well as with this particular territory.
Next question is in relation to what you have mentioned about the revival of Chinese Australian history. In various areas for all sorts of reasons, not just focused on the gold rush, but all other aspects that are actually people, for one reason or another, overlooked or less regarded. So this question is coming from Dr. Wang. He's asking, is the current pandemic reinforcing some, if not all, stereotypes about Chinese in Australia? And would you see that as a major setback to the revival or de-whitewashing and de-colonizing review on Chinese Australian history?
No, because I think the situation today is very different from what it was in the past. In the past, during the whitewashing period, the Chinese community was being reduced in size and being isolated in stereotypes and in Chinatowns and so forth. And they had no opportunity to kind of fight back. But today, yes, of course, you've got increased racism, increased stereotypes, or people bringing out their old stereotypes and kind of waving them around as if they're real. But you've got far more people of Chinese origin, Chinese heritage, who are willing to say, well, that's just rubbish, and to argue and push back. And so I think what you're going to get is more just debate about the history, and more maybe every time a stereotype pops up, then you've got people are willing to say, well, no, that's not quite true, and to argue it out. And so the history will become more alive and more debated, which is good. But I don't think, no, we're going to drift back into that kind of old whitewashing. That's no longer possible. But the too many people with too much of a vested interest in bringing more of the history out. And that'll be contested. I mean, it won't always be the history that I agree with, or you know, and somewhat, as I said, there's a danger of new stereotypes coming out, not the old ones, but newer ones, or sometimes people investing in these old stereotypes for different reasons. But that's what history is all about, is arguing about these things and discussing them. And you know, people won't agree with everything I've said today, and they don't have to. It's just a question of arguing it and debating it and being clear. And always challenging stereotypes, including the new ones that quickly can arise.
You also mentioned that these days, I mean, Chinese covers a wide range of concepts, you know, mainland Chinese or Taiwan Chinese or Hong Kong Chinese or overseas Chinese. When we do research, should we also make a distinction between Sino-Sinophile and Chinese China?
Yes, I think so, because I mean it's always about how people self-identify. So I mean these labels are often imposed by the media or by academics or whatever. I mean, you know, we use the term Chinese very easily, of course, and of course the English term China and Chinese is a different, you know, is a narrower meaning than words in Chinese themselves. But you got to look at how people self-identify. I mean, people happily identify as Chinese and they mean, you know, that they're from China. But there are people who also identify as Chinese, they've never been to China. Their parents, grandparents might have been born in Indonesia, and their parents migrated to Australia and they themselves were born in Sydney, but they still think of themselves as Chinese. But what they would think of when they say that is, of course, very different from someone born in Shanghai who came to Australia 5 years ago. You know, and a Shanghai person is different from a Beijing person. We know perfectly well that China is not a very unified place in many ways. I mean, there's dialects, there's cultural differences, there's all kinds of differences, very easily as strong as the old differences in Britain were between Scots and English and Irish and so forth. It takes time to bring these together. So these labels, the very word Chinese is very dangerous, and we should always be unpicking it. It's useful for some things, but it's a label that's both from self-identification but also imposed from the outside, and we need to look at both sides of that kind of identification. People, you know, again, if we look at more the older history, I mean, in the 19th century, it's Cantonese, it's Taishan people. This is how people identify themselves. So it's important as an historian for me to unpick that, because that's how people thought of themselves. They didn't think of themselves as Chinese. Later on, they began to think of themselves as Chinese, but often that was for political reasons. This was during the Republican period. They were doing that because they were identifying themselves with the Kuomintang or with a particular nation. But then you had people who were never part of that history. They came from Singapore or from Indonesia or other places, but still have an identity as Chinese. But that must mean different things. We should always be aware of what that means, even as we're kind of generalizing and inevitably have to use these general terms.
Talking about generalization and the stereotype, in the olden days, you know, you mentioned Chinese were stereotyped as cigar smoking and ginger beer drinking. Why ginger beer drinking?
Well, that's why I like that quote. It's a good. I mean, ginger beer was very common in the colonial period as a drink. I mean, if you didn't want to drink an alcoholic drink and a beer or so forth, so you still wanted something refreshing. It was hot on the goldfields, so ginger beer was what they were drinking, and cigars. I mean, again, the stereotype is they should all be smoking opium, but opium is expensive, and you didn't do that while you're watching opera. Why would you do that? You'd be wasting you're wasting your good opium. So you do that somewhere else when you want to relax. So of course there was cigar smoking, but because of our stereotypes, we think of that as something a bit unusual and exotic. But for the observer at the time, he was going to the opera, and Europeans often went to these Chinese operas. It was very common to have European observers. In fact, in the later period, I'll talk about that in another lecture, the Chinese managers of these operas handed out bills in English explaining the plot, so as to encourage European audience to come in. I mean, anyone's money is worth as good as anyone else's if they wanted to come and watch. And so you know, down in Sydney there was opera being performed and watched. But we think, you know, nobody understands that was fairly normal behaviour because our stereotypes have not allowed us to see that far, see into that history.
Opera performance, and I have a Nick said, I once performed in a contemporary opera about the 19th century Chinese in New Zealand. they seem to have many similarities to the Chinese in Australia. For example, they sent their bones back to China and also intermarried with a local Maori. Was there much movement of the Chinese between Australia and New Zealand? Would certain people have tried their luck in both places?
Yes and no. I mean, the New Zealanders and New Zealand Chinese almost all had to come through Sydney. So it was a strong connection. They would take the boats down from Hong Kong to Sydney and transship across to New Zealand. And there was a lot of special arrangements made both with immigration and with the Chinese organisations. There were dormitories up in the rocks where people would stay while waiting for a new ship to go across to New Zealand and so forth. So there's quite a lot of connection between Australia and New Zealand, as you'd expect. But in terms of the actual families, not a great deal until the post-war period, because like all Chinese migrations, they tended to be chain migrations, family migrations, and the main groups that went to New Zealand were from the Zhenjiang area and a few other areas, whereas Zhongshan in Sydney, for example. I mean, there was overlaps, but and of course there were family connections. But yeah, no, people once established in New Zealand tended to go and stay in New Zealand and come back through Sydney. So of course there was some, but not as much as you might think. Just as between Victoria and New South Wales. I mean, again, the sea up down in Melbourne and the Zhongshan and other dominates in Sydney. There's quite a distinction, and people didn't associate with each other so much until a much later period when those dialect barriers began to fade away, which wasn't until much later into the 20th century.
Another very interesting question comes from Kate. Is there a difference in attitude towards historical Chinese immigration between Australian populations in different parts of Australia? For example, those in the Northern Territory versus those from Victoria during 19th and early 20th century?
Yes. I mean, and that's another very unresearched part of Australian Chinese history. Although again, I'll talk a little bit more about that in later lectures. But because the interesting thing about the Northern Queensland, for example, Cairns had a majority Chinese population at one stage, as did Darwin. I mean, you had areas that were strongly Chinese and where the Europeans were a minority. And this meant for very different relationships between people in the communities. I mean, people got on quite well, and there wasn't animosity. That didn't result in large animosity or anything, but it meant that they were much more confident. People growing up in Darwin had a very different relationship and different matters of self-confidence than those down in Sydney, where they were kind of an isolated minority in the 1940s and 1950s. So yes, and this is something that isn't well researched. Even between Sydney, Victoria, and New South Wales, there was quite large differences. In many ways, the Victorians catered for their Chinese population much more, both in terms of kind of tolerating, but also trying to discriminate against. They had more discriminatory laws in Victoria than New South Wales did. Again, I think just a question of how they Victorians just seem to have a stronger sense of wanting to kind of defend themselves against this, and New South Wales seem to be a bit more relaxed, but only marginally, but enough. You can just see it in the history, see it in the laws that were and the attitudes and so forth. And in the Northern Queensland, again, very different again. West Australia, again, different broom. I mean, it depends on where you are. And again, we haven't, there isn't a good comparative history that looks at these things. That tend to be, histories of Chinese in Australia tend to be only histories really of Victoria and New South Wales. Or there's a few local histories, but they haven't been well integrated into the overall history. And Tasmania, again, another interesting history that was quite different from Melbourne or Sydney.
Question from Jasmine. How long did the Chinese gold miners usually stay in Australia?
Well, we don't have good statistics for that period. We have statistics for later periods, and based on those statistics, you could say the average was that person came and stayed 7 years, by and large, 5 to 7 years, and then you went back and married. So people came out fairly young. You needed a certain period of time to pay off your debt. I mean, characteristically, people came owing money. They had to work for someone else to pay off that debt, then earn a bit of money, enough money to send back to the family, and the family would then say, all right, now you're an eligible bachelor, we'll arrange a wife. Then you come back, marry, stay long enough to perhaps hopefully begin a family. and then come back again and stay another few years. But this is based on statistics from the market gardening periods, late 19th, early 20th century. There are some accounts from the gold period, which suggests it's similar, that people would come and stay for a few years. Again, it depends how long it takes you to make some money. I mean, assuming you make any money. And then once you do, then you can send that money back, and then you can go back with it, buy a house. And again, we have a very interesting guy, a guy giving witness to a Royal Commission in the 1860s, I think it was, or late 1850s, in which he just said, yeah, we go back and buy a house, and then we buy a wife, or one or two or three. You know, he was obviously very keen to get as many wives as possible. But although, again, we don't think people had too many wives, one or two tended to be at the average in most of these southern Chinese villages. Only very rich merchants had quite large numbers of wives. But yeah, I mean, so that tends to be the general pattern that had. But again, it varies. Some people never went back. And that didn't mean they were cut off. Some people never went back, but they still sent money back, or they sent their brother back and arranged for him to be married, or this kind of thing. They kept up a connection. So in their mind, in their psychology, they were still connected, even if they didn't go back. Others lost contact completely, never went back, never sent money back, did nothing, but settled in Australia. Again, we can only guess at the reasons for that. Maybe their family was completely killed. Maybe they just felt shame that they never made any money. I mean, there's various stories. Everyone's got a different story, and it's harder to work out the pattern, the exact pattern of that.
Yeah, we have more interesting questions. This is really good. Very active participations. Li Pen asked the question, let's see. Wondering if there is any historical documentary evidence that shows any Chinese were killed in Lamping Flat.
No, there doesn't seem to be. I mean, some of the stories coming out on Lamping Flat were very lurid and very exaggerated. They're often written by journalists who weren't even there. The reason why I'm fairly confident that there was no one killed, no Chinese person killed, is because two reasons. One is that these goldfields were fairly heavily policed, and coroner's reports and so forth, investigations of any deaths, were very strong in Victoria and New South Wales. I mean, this one's the anarchy of California. California was virtually government, had no government during their gold rush period. Australia and New South Wales and Victoria had been colonies for 50 years or more, British colonies, and so the rule of law was quite strong, and the investigation of what happens with the deaths they were always investigated. And the other thing was that the Chinese Lamping Flat put in for compensation. There's an interesting report where they asked for thousands of pounds worth of compensation to pay them back for all their tents that were burned and all the kinds of things. And none of those compensation claims mentioned anyone dying. And so it doesn't make any sense. If you're going actually for money, and obviously you get more money if someone's actually died, it would have been in their interest to emphasize that. They're completely silent on that. The compensation claims are entirely about loss of material goods and that kind of thing. So, you know, I don't think there's any reason. I mean, the Lamping Flat thing, it's actually part of Australia's wide Australian history of a later period. It becomes a big thing in the 1880s and 90s when people are wanting to kind of say, you know, we should be a white Australia. Look how glorious our miners were in the past at the great victory of Lamping Flat. And so they began to make up stories about Lamping Flat themselves, including, you know, and obviously if they want to make how brave they were, they want to say they killed somebody. I mean, they were quite happy to do that. But they were just making it up. There was no real, there's no evidence of that, and no reason for that to happen. I mean, there's plenty of violence going on without murdering people all over the place. I mean, certain people were driven off the field, but then they came back and they say they asked for compensation. They got compensation as well. Not as much as they wanted, but they got some.
Following up with a little question from Li Pan also, and he's asking, why did the Chinese were called Zhang or Zhang Chinamen? Any special meaning in Zhang?
Well, it's interesting because I read a report of a missionary in China, and he was very annoyed because every time he walked around the villages, they called him John. So it seems to be something. It was just an easy name. Everybody was named John. My middle name is John. It was a funny kind of thing. So yes, everybody seemed to have an easy word for a group of people. They couldn't be interested in knowing what their real names were. They're too hard to pronounce. So just John. But yes, Chinese obviously seem to call everybody John. any European John in China. So I'm not sure who started it, but yes, I mean, John was just, yeah, I don't know. Well, there were other names too. Charlie was another common name. I mean, just making up names. Sometimes they were loosely based on people's real names, just a variation in pronunciation. Other times they just came. It was very common for Aboriginal people as well. Aboriginal peoples were just given names by white people, just kind of European names, and they would just make up a name because they just couldn't be bothered to learn any of their real names, or an Aboriginal person wasn't interested in telling their real name anyway to these people. Why would that? You know, the names have special meaning, of course, to some groups.
Question from Daryl. Michael, do you think we have a composite view of the history of a Chinese Australia on a national basis, or is it skewed to state-centric colony?
Yes, I think we're nowhere near getting a good overview of Chinese Australian history around Australia. We need a good regional comparative. It's not just state view. Northern Queensland is quite different from Brisbane, for example. There's a big variation there. Queensland, as usual, is different. You know, and what's going on in Sydney is quite different from what's going on in the regional areas. We've got some very interesting regional histories. Northern New South Wales has been very well done. We haven't gone well into West Australia very well. There's a few things being done, but they've been done locally, and they haven't been brought together either to show the pattern or to show the comparatives, to show the differences. For instance, Darwin, many people were coming to Darwin via Singapore, and there were a lot more wives, a lot more women in Darwin than there were in other parts of Australia. So this meant there were a lot more families. So the vibe in Darwin is very different from what it is down in the southeastern states. But again, to appreciate that difference and why the difference is important, you have to know more about the history. It has to be more than just about racism and discriminatory laws. Those laws were the same all over Australia in theory, although again, the way the White Australia policy was implemented varied around Australia. Very different in Darwin and in Broome than it was in Sydney, for example. And so that's another aspect that we haven't looked at carefully enough. But it takes a lot more detailed history. But we need it's getting there. The material is there. There's a lot of new PhD students, for example, doing very interesting work, and this will be published over the years, and we'll be in a position to do a better history fairly soon, I think.
I have summing up a question. Last thing you said, you know, history is a constant struggle with the present, and given the context of that, there is a revival of Chinese Australian history. What do you think it will lead to? You know, especially in the context of other aspects of which have been overlooked or less regarded. What's this revival or relook?
Well, I think this is why I focus on the idea of motivations. It's very hard to tell. I think it's at this stage, it could go it can go in various directions, and probably will go in a direction I can't even think of. I mean, ideally, for me as an historian who likes to kind of aim for some kind of objective history, I'm hoping to broaden it out and have a lot more nuances there, more comparatives, and be aware of things. But I'm also aware that for history for many people is political. It's about establishing an identity, or it's about, you know, putting people's setting people's identity in place, and so they will pick and choose, and this is inevitable. I mean, I don't think that can be avoided. So I think hopefully the future will be showing Chinese Australian history is much more integrated, much more natural part of Australia. I mean, even the term Chinese Australian history, it's still kind of classifying as separate from Australian history in some ways, and really the Australian history has to improve and to show that this is a natural part of it, that Chinese opera is a natural part of Australian history. It's not something exotic that was hidden away. It wasn't hidden away. People knew all about it. It's a natural part of the history. But Australian history has to unpick its own whitewashing a lot more. It's doing that more increasingly so, I would say, Aboriginal history, Indigenous history. And obviously the next largest one would be Chinese Australian history, as well as more generally other histories. But again, this idea of migrant histories is something that we have to play around with. You know, when do people stop being migrants? When did it stop being just simply part of the history of Australia? So it's going to move in that way, but I think it'll take a few generations. But in the meantime, I think if we can at least get a bit more of comparative going around Australia and a bit more nuance into the depth of the history, we'll do something. But again, we've got to look more carefully at the history post-World War II as well. And of course, that gets us into another minefield entirely as China. I mean, obviously the big change is that China itself looms larger in Australian history. I mean, even in the past, China was always there as a kind of like a fear. And now this fear is becoming reality for some people. And so this is going to impact on how we see the history as well. I think history plays a very important role in trying to modify that, or at least to tone it down and make sure that not too many stereotypes again get created along the way.
Well, I think it's time is up, so we really should stop here. And thank you so much, Professor Michael Williams. This is such a knowledgeable, refined historian. It's wonderful to hear him talk and give the presentation, also answer all these fascinating, interesting questions. And thank you all, everyone who attending this presentation, and for your very active participation. We will schedule the remaining lectures. I think there will be 4 remaining ones monthly. So the next one should be the first week of August. We will send you the information. So we will hope to see you there again. And we will also post the recorded session on our website for easier distribution as well. So thank you so much. And I wish you all a nice weekend. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll see you. Bye.